The snow had been falling since dusk, soft and steady, turning the lakeside streets of Geneva into glistening ribbons of white. Inside the grand diplomatic residence overlooking the water, warmth and candlelight reigned, casting gold across marble floors and crystal glasses. Voices in half a dozen languages drifted through the high-ceilinged salon, where ambassadors and envoys gathered for an evening reception meant to celebrate unity. Yet, by midnight, unity was the last thing anyone would feel. A scream split the refined murmur of conversation. Guests surged toward the Sorcian inner study at the end of a long corridor, its carved wooden door firmly closed. The scream had come from inside, unmistakably so. Several hands rattled the handle. Locked. Someone fetched the steward, who arrived breathless with a key ring. It took 3 tries before the correct key turned. The door opened inward to a silence so complete that even the ticking of a clock sounded loud. The body lay across the Persian rug, one arm flung toward a toppled chair, the other resting near a fallen glass that had spilled dark red wine across cream silk. The victim was a senior diplomat, respected, discreet, known for his calm intellect. Now his eyes stared at nothing, his skin already taking on the pallor of death. A single lamp illuminated the scene. No window stood open, no balcony door unlocked. The room had only one entrance door they had just opened. There were gasps, hurried whispers, the flutter of panic contained by diplomatic training. Someone checked for a pulse. None. Someone else called for the local authorities. No one noticed at first the small detail that would later become the heart of the riddle. On the desk, precisely centered on a stack of official documents, lay a folded sheet of paper. No handwriting, no signature. Just a printed line in bold, immaculate type. The truth arrives at 10 minutes past midnight. The clock on the wall read 12:16. The police arrived swiftly, their boots leaving wet trails on polished floors. The study was sealed, guests confined to the salon under discreet supervision. Everyone present had been accounted for since the reception began. No one had entered or left the study after dinner. The victim had retired there alone to make a confidential telephone call. A servant had brought coffee at 11:40 and found the door already locked from the inside. The servant had left the tray outside, assuming privacy was requested. No sounds followed until the scream 16 minutes past midnight. The medical examiner confirmed death occurred within minutes of that scream. No weapon was found. No bruising, no struggle, no sign of forced entry. Poison was suspected, but the glass contained only wine. The coffee cup on the tray outside the door was untouched. The victim's pockets held nothing unusual. No vial, no note, no clue except the typed message on the desk. The officers examined the lock. Old, solid, mechanical. No tampering. No duplicate key missing. No hidden passage in the walls. No vent large enough for human passage. The windows were shut and latched from the inside. It was a room sealed from the world, a death that should not have been possible. Guests offered anxious testimonies. A rival diplomat who had argued with the victim earlier. A secretary who looked frightened but claimed ignorance. A spouse who insisted the victim had no enemies. Each voice added noise, none added clarity. The message on the desk baffled everyone. Why announce truth after death? Why 12:10? Why was it placed so neatly, so deliberately, as though the murderer wanted it to be seen? By 2 in the morning, the police chief rubbed tired eyes and admitted what no one wanted to say aloud. The case was impossible. A locked room with no method, no weapon, no suspect, and a message that sounded like a riddle. It was then, in the hush after the officials left the study, that a small, fastidious man with a trimmed mustache stepped quietly into the salon. He had arrived unnoticed among the diplomatic guests, invited for his reputation rather than his nationality. He observed the room, the nervous faces, the guarded whispers, the door to the study still sealed by police tape. He murmured softly to himself, eyes bright with interest. "A crime that declares itself unsolvable," he said. "How charming, how very tempting." And thus the riddle of Geneva began. The police chief was still giving instructions when the small mustached gentleman stepped forward with polite confidence. "Permit me," he said, his French precise, his tone mild. "I am Hercule Poirot. I was invited this evening by the embassy secretary. Perhaps I may be of assistance." The chief looked him over compact frame, immaculate suit, eyes far too alert for the hour, and gave a reluctant nod. There was little to lose in an impossible case. Poirot entered the study alone, the door closing behind him with soft finality. He stood still for a long moment, absorbing everything, not merely seeing, but observing. The lamp, the rug, the fallen chair, the spilled wine creeping toward the edge of a silk hem, the untouched coffee tray outside the door, the typed message on the desk. He approached the body first, not touching, only studying. The diplomat's expression was curious, less terror than astonishment. Poirot noted the position of the hand, the slightly stiffened fingers, the way the collar sat neatly against the neck. No sign of a struggle, no disruption to the immaculate order of the room. Then Poirot examined the desk. Papers were stacked with obsessive precision. A fountain pen lay capped. A telephone sat on its cradle, no sign of recent use. The typed message lay squarely atop the documents, centered as though measured with a ruler. Poirot leaned closer. The paper was crisp, uncreased, freshly printed. He sniffed delicately. Ink and machine oil. Very recent. He lifted the sheet with 2 fingers. Underneath it, the documents were perfectly aligned. That meant the note had been placed after the desk was tidied for the evening, not earlier in the day, he murmured. So, the message was delivered into a locked room. He moved to the door, examined the lock, the frame, the hinges. Solid. No trick mechanism, no tampering. The servant's statement echoed in his mind. The door had been locked at 11:40 from the inside. No one entered afterward. Poirot returned to the center of the room and simply thought. A scream at 12:16. Death within minutes. A message announcing 10 minutes past midnight. A sealed room. No weapon. He smiled faintly. Not because he found humor, but because the problem was beginning to take shape. The door opened gently, and the embassy secretary entered, pale and strained. She was a woman in her 30s, efficient, controlled, but her hands trembled just slightly. "Inspector, is there progress?" she asked. Poirot regarded her. "Mademoiselle, I understand you organized the guest list." "Yes." "And you invited me." "Yes." The ambassador suggested it. "For reputation." She swallowed. "I never imagined." Poirot inclined his head sympathetically. "Tell me, did anyone behave unusually this evening?" She hesitated. "They are diplomats. Unusual is their profession." Poirot's eyes glinted. "Nevertheless, there was a disagreement earlier," she admitted, "between the victim and another envoy. Quiet but intense. I could not hear the words." "Who?" She gave a name. Poirot stored it away without reaction, and when the scream occurred, Poirot asked, "Where were you?" "In the salon, with everyone else." "Did anyone leave the room afterward?" "Before the police arrived." "No, I saw to that myself." Poirot nodded. "You are very efficient." A faint flush crossed her cheeks. "Thank you." Poirot let her leave, then stepped into the corridor. The coffee tray still sat outside the study door. The cup was full, untouched. He lifted it, inhaled. Coffee, plain. No scent of almond, no bitterness of chemical interference. He set it down again. The servant who had delivered it was summoned. A nervous young man, apologizing repeatedly. "You locked the door at 11:40, yes?" Poirot asked. "Yes, monsieur." The gentleman requested privacy. "Did you see him alive after that?" "No, monsieur." "Did you hear any sound from within?" "Nothing, until the scream." Poirot dismissed him kindly. Then he walked slowly back to the salon where clusters of diplomats whispered in uneasy knots. Eyes watched him, some with hope, some with fear. He stood among them, small and unassuming, yet quietly commanding attention. A murderer, Poirot thought, walks freely in this room. And the key to the riddle lies not in what is seen but in what is assumed. The first threads of deception had begun to show, though the pattern was not yet complete. And somewhere, in the polished silence of the diplomatic gathering, truth waited for 10 minutes past midnight to arrive. Poirot did not waste time. The longer a murderer remained unchallenged, the more confident they became. Confidence bred mistakes. And mistakes were what he collected. The police chief allowed him a corner of the salon, a small table beneath a chandelier whose light shimmered against crystal and nervous eyes. One by one, the guests were invited to sit before him. Not interrogate, no. Poirot merely conversed, politely, softly, like a man curious about human nature. The first was the rival envoy, tall and severe, his jaw set like carved stone. He sat stiffly, hands folded. "You and the victim had a disagreement earlier," Poirot began. The envoy's eyes flickered. "Diplomatic debate, nothing more." "At what time?" "After dinner. Perhaps 10:30. "You spoke in private?" "For a moment." Poirot smiled gently. "You must forgive me, monsieur. I collect details the way others collect stamps. Was anyone else present?" "No." Poirot inclined his head. "And after this debate, I returned to the salon. I remained there until the scream." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Not once did you leave, not once." Poirot thanked him and let him go. But as the envoy stood, Poirot noticed something, an almost imperceptible adjustment of his cuff, as though ensuring something hidden beneath the sleeve remained secure. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. Next came the secretary. She sat gracefully, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "You kept watch over the salon after the scream," Poirot said. "Yes, no one left." Poirot nodded. "You are certain?" "Absolutely." Poirot's gaze softened. "And earlier in the evening, did anyone request access to the study?" she thought. "No. Only the victim himself." Poirot tilted his head. "Did anyone inquire about him after he retired?" "Yes." The rival envoy asked if he might speak with him again. "I told him the gentleman had requested privacy." Poirot's eyebrows lifted slightly. Ah, a small contradiction had appeared. The envoy claimed he had not left the salon after dinner, but he had shown interest in meeting the victim again, a motive to approach. Yet opportunity remained uncertain. Then the servant who delivered coffee was recalled, this time before Poirot alone. "You placed the tray outside the door," Poirot said, "and the door was locked." "Yes, monsieur. Did you knock?" The servant blinked. "No. I assumed he did not wish to be disturbed." Poirot nodded. "And when the scream came, from where were you?" "In the kitchen corridor." "Did you see anyone near the study before or after?" "No, monsieur." Poirot let him go. Another piece that fit neatly, perhaps too neatly. The victim's spouse was last, a dignified woman, impeccably dressed, eyes rimmed with red but voice steady. "My husband had no enemies," she said firmly. Poirot did not contradict her. Instead he asked, did he receive any unusual messages today? She hesitated. He mentioned a phone call earlier. He did not say from whom. Poirot's eyes flicked briefly to the study telephone in his memory, on its cradle. No sign of recent use. Did he seem troubled? No. Only thoughtful. Poirot smiled gently. "Thoughtful men are often closest to discovering inconvenient truths." She stiffened. "What do you mean?" Poirot merely bowed. "Forgive me, madam." I think aloud. When she left, Poirot remained seated, hands steepled, mind assembling voices like instruments in an orchestriach note slightly off-key. No one admitted to leaving the salon. Yet someone had placed a note inside a locked study. Someone had foreseen a scream at 12:16. Someone had knowledge of 10 minutes past midnight that no one else possessed. Too many people claimed certainty. Too many neat answers. Too much cooperation. Poirot rose and walked once more to the study door. The police tape remained. The corridor was quiet now, the house sinking into the uneasy hush of late night. He looked at the lock again, then at the note inside, visible through the glass panel of the door. "The truth arrives at 10 minutes past midnight," he murmured. Poirot smiled faintly. Then he said to himself, "We must simply ask, whose truth?" And with that question the game moved forward, tightening around the hidden motives lurking beneath polished diplomatic smiles. Poirot returned to the study once more, his keen eyes scanning every surface as though the room itself might whisper its secrets. The more he looked, the more he felt the invisible threads of human desire stretched taut across the polished walls. Greed, jealousy, fear, ambition, each emotion left a trace, subtle, almost imperceptible, but perceptible to a mind trained to see beyond appearances. He began with the rival envoy. A disagreement earlier in the evening seemed trivial on the surface, a polite diplomatic quarrel, but Poirot remembered the slight flicker in the envoy's eyes when the secretary mentioned the victim's private call. The envoy had wanted access, claimed he did not leave the salon, yet he had watched, and waited. Was it curiosity or something darker? Poirot noted the cuff adjustment again, a hand that conceals can also control. Perhaps a vial hidden in a sleeve, a tiny instrument of fate. Next, the secretary. Her careful efficiency was admirable, but Poirot noticed the rapidity with which she had tried to corral the guests after the scream. Was it purely professional vigilance, or an instinct born from fear that someone would discover more than she intended? She had admitted the envoy inquired about the victim, though she claimed to have declined. Yet she did not mention whether the envoy might have lingered nearby, or how closely she had observed him afterward. Small omissions, perhaps insignificant, perhaps critical. The spouse presented a different puzzle. Unassuming, calm, asserting devotion, yet Poirot remembered the brief hesitation when asked about unusual messages. A careful thought, a private communication, might have held the key. Jealousy or hidden knowledge can wear a mask of composure, especially among those accustomed to secrecy and protocol. She had motive of a subtler kind of fear of scandal, a desire to protect, or perhaps resentment under the veneer of civility. Poirot considered the servant once more. Young, nervous, and eager to please, yet in such service loyalty can conceal complicity. Could a simple lock on a door become an instrument of opportunity for one who knew the house as intimately as he did? The servant's absolute confidence in the timeline was convenient, almost rehearsed. Convenient truths often conceal inconvenient ones. Then there was the victim himself, a man of intellect, meticulous habits, and careful relationships. Perhaps the crime was orchestrated to mirror his own careful precision, a mirror held to the wronged, to the envious, or to the ambitious. Whoever had plotted this had observed him as closely as he observed others, noting his routines, his habits, his trust in servants, in protocol, in diplomacy. Poirot laid it out in his mind like an intricate chessboard. Each suspect held a piece, each piece could be moved with cunning precision. The envoy could strike from opportunity disguised as etiquette. The secretary could manipulate access with the polite efficiency expected of her role. The spouse could hide truths behind calm reassurance. The servant could provide the means to enact the crime in secrecy. And all movements had been timed to perfection, exploiting a schedule, a locked door, and a carefully chosen moment. Yet no single thread explained everything. The message on the desk, the cryptic announcement of truth, was both taunt and clue. Who knew the precise moment, 10 minutes past midnight, when the scream would occur? Who orchestrated the timing so flawlessly, leaving the room sealed, the body discovered at the exact moment to puzzle and mislead? Poirot sipped his coffee thoughtfully, eyes returning to the Persian rug. The fallen wine, the displaced chair, the alignment of documents, small details that seemed insignificant, yet perfectly deliberate. Each suggested planning, observation, patience, and behind patience, motive. A tangled maze of human intent and emotion lay before him. No single theory could untangle it. Greed might be paired with envy, revenge hidden under civility, fear masked by loyalty. He could see the connections, like fine threads drawn across the room, linking hands, glances, and silences. To outsiders, the threads were invisible. To Poirot, they formed a lattice of intention, each susceptible to his scrutiny. He allowed himself a small smile. The solution, he knew, would not come from a single clue, but from the pattern of human behavior itself. By examining desires, contradictions, and subtleties, he would trace the path to the one who had dared to manipulate time, perception, and trust. For now, the suspects waited, each confident in their version of truth. But Poirot's mind moved ahead, threading the labyrinth of motives, preparing to illuminate the hidden connections that would expose the murderer's hand. Every detail, every hesitation, every subtle gesture would soon converge, and the seemingly unsolvable riddle of Geneva would begin to yield its secrets. The morning light crept through the tall windows of the diplomatic residence, casting long, pale shafts across the salon, where the remaining guests now gathered in uneasy silence. The police chief had summoned an early briefing, and whispers of progress buzzed through the corridors. A piece of evidence had been found, a vial, cleverly hidden in a drawer of the study, labeled with the victim's initials and containing a lethal dose of a rare poison. The authorities were ecstatic, certain that the case was nearly closed. Poirot, however, remained seated in a quiet corner, sipping his coffee with the deliberate patience of a man who had no desire to be rushed. He had examined the vial, its neat placement and polished appearance. Too neat, too deliberate. Someone wanted the authorities to find it. Someone wanted them to feel the satisfaction of a solved mystery, while the real solution remained concealed. The chief beamed as he announced their theory. The rival envoy must have had access to the study after dinner, and the poison explains the instantaneous nature of death. It is all consistentes should conclude our investigation. The diplomats murmured their approval, relief apparent in their stiff postures. Even the secretary appeared reassured, though Poirot noted a subtle tightening around her mouth that betrayed lingering uncertainty. Poirot stood slowly, his small frame belying the intensity in his eyes. "Ah, but monsieur," he said softly, addressing the chief, "there is something curious." The chief, puffed with pride, waved a hand. "Curious? Mon Dieu, we have found the killer's instrument. What more curiosity is needed?" Poirot's eyes swept the room, not at the gathered diplomats, but at the minute details surrounding them. The alignment of papers, the undisturbed coffee tray, the faint scuff marks on the rug that no one had noticed. "Yes," he said, "we have a vial, indeed. But consider carefully. The room was locked from the inside. Yes, the victim retired there alone. The scream came almost immediately. The coffee tray remained untouched. And yet, this vial is conveniently located, left in a drawer accessible to anyone searching afterward." He leaned closer to the chief, his voice low but sharp. "It is placed, monsieur, as a decoy, to lead you to a conclusion that appears satisfying, but which may be entirely false." The chief blinked, caught between disbelief and irritation. "You suggest—" "What? That our breakthrough is fabricated?" Poirot inclined his head. "I suggest only that one must always examine the motives behind each action. Who benefits from an early declaration of victory? Who might find comfort in a resolution that is not real?" He allowed the words to settle, then moved toward the study door. "The true perpetrator, monsieur, has orchestrated more than a crime. They have orchestrated perception, exploiting eagerness, exploiting assumption. They are watching, waiting, confident that a false solution will satisfy the observers while they remain free." The room fell silent, save for the faint whisper of the chandeliers. Even the rival envoy's rigid posture faltered slightly, though he did not dare to look directly at Poirot. The secretary's hands clenched momentarily, the only outward sign of inattention. The spouse's composed exterior did not mask a flicker of concern. Poirot turned back to the chief. "Yes, the vial exists, and yes, it may contain poison. But there is no evidence that it caused death, and no one has accounted for the mechanism by which a sealed room could be accessed or manipulated." "I observe, monsieur, that a real criminal does not announce themselves through a conveniently discovered clue." "That is the hallmark of a trap," the chief bristled. "You would have us ignore this evidence." Poirot's gaze softened, but his tone carried an unyielding weight. "No, monsieur, but we must not be deceived by it. We must look beyond what is obvious and examine the unseen. For the moment, the real culprit remains in the shadows, and shadows, as you know, are patient." As he spoke, a faint sound reached his ears, almost imperceptible, the soft click of a door handle somewhere down the corridor. Poirot's eyes narrowed. No one should be moving unobserved. The murderer could be anywhere, concealed in plain sight, waiting for a moment of overconfidence from the authorities to strike Agatha, perhaps to watch and delight as they praised their own resolution. He turned slowly to face the gathered diplomats, his expression calm, almost gentle, yet radiating an authority that made no one dare challenge him. "We must continue," he said simply, "for a crime such as this is not satisfied by appearances alone. The victory you celebrate is false. The truth remains to be uncovered." And with that, Poirot stepped back toward the study, his mind already tracing the intricate lattice of motives, opportunities, and subtle deceptions, aware that the real riddle of Geneva was far from solved. Poirot lingered in the study long after the authorities had departed, eyes tracing the familiar lines of the polished wood, the neat stacks of papers, the faint impressions left on the rug by the victim's last movements. His mind, always attuned to patterns, had begun to dwell on minutiae that no one else had noticed: a slip of a cuff, a faint stain in the corner of a document, a hesitation in a witness tone. Each detail was a thread, and Poirot was determined to follow it to its origin. He returned to the victim's desk, bending to examine the edges of the papers. There, hidden beneath the top sheet, was an envelope that had gone unnoticed. Yellowed slightly with age, brittle at the corners, it carried no immediate significancia, so it seemed. But Poirot, with his precise memory and subtle intuition, sensed the import. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of correspondence, an old letter, written in a neat hand, decades earlier, addressed to the victim but with the same initials as the rival envoy. The letter was brief but pointed. It recounted a dispute from years past, a matter of inheritance, an accusation of betrayal, and a sharp warning that the consequences of deceit would linger long after the original offense. The names had changed, the circumstances had faded into diplomatic anonymity, but the essence remained. Old grievances could fester quietly, unnoticed, until a moment perfectly chosen to revive them. Poirot's eyes gleamed. The past was speaking to him now, whispering through paper and ink. The seemingly innocuous quarrel between the victim and the envoy was not simply a matter of present disagreement. It had roots buried in old resentment, a shared history no one else in the room could appreciate. Perhaps the envoy's carefully cultivated calm mask had concealed decades of anger, of meticulous plotting, of a desire to exact justice or revenge, or both. Yet the connection was not linear. The secretary's role now took on a new hue in Poirot's mind. Her efficiency, her vigilance, her subtle omissions. Perhaps she had once been an unwitting participant in the events that had long since passed, a messenger or observer who had witnessed small betrayals. Her presence at the reception, her knowledge of the guests, her ability to control movement within the residence, these were not mere happenstance. Could she, consciously or unconsciously, have been influenced by the old grievance, drawn into a chain of events whose origins predated the current crime?
I am
Poirot's
making
gaze shifted to the
inquiries
spouse,
regarding the
calm
guest in
and
suite
composed.
402.
She had claimed
Do
ignorance,
you know if
yet
he
the
is
faint
currently
hesitation
in
regarding
residence?
unusual
One moment,
messages
sir.
now
I shall
suggested
check
that
the
she might be
register
aware of
immediately.
connections beyond immediate perception. Perhaps the victim himself had known fragments of the old story, fragments enough to provoke caution, enough to make someone act decisively to preserve secrets. He traced the lines in his mind. The envoy, the secretary, the spouse, the servant, all linked, not by simple motive, not by straightforward opportunity, but by a network of small events, decisions, and alliances buried in the past. What seemed at first a crime of the memento death in a locked study, a cryptic note, a conveniently discovered vial, was in reality the climax of a drama decades in the making, orchestrated to exploit not just timing and opportunity, but memory itself. Poirot leaned back, fingers steepled. "Ah, oui," he murmured. "The present cannot be understood without the past. The roots of human behavior run deep. The old grudges, the unresolved debts, the quiet observations, are the soil from which this crime has grown." He rose and walked to the study door, considering the corridor beyond. The shadows that had seemed merely atmospheric now felt alive with intention. Not just the shadows of the present, but the shadows of memory, of history, of connections long hidden. Whoever had orchestrated this crime had studied not only the room, not only the schedule, not only the personalities, but the histories entwined, the subtle debts owed, the lingering tensions that had quietly persisted until now. Poirot knew that to unravel the murder in the locked study, he would have to reconstruct not only the physical movements of that fateful night, but also the emotional and psychological currents that stretched back years. A careful mapping of the past would illuminate the present, revealing patterns invisible to those who saw only what was immediately before their eyes. And in that realization, Poirot felt a thrill familiar and invigorating. The case was no longer merely a puzzle of doors and locks, of a scream in the night, or a note on a desk. It was a web of human frailty and memory, and somewhere within it lay the key, the identity of the one who had waited patiently in the shadows, guided by history, to strike at exactly the right moment. Poirot returned to the salon where the diplomats and staff had reconvened, his small frame moving with calm deliberation through the clusters of whispered conversation. The day had dragged on with routine questioning, and the authorities, confident in their discovery of the vial, had become complacent. But Poirot needed more than ordinary observations. He required an unconventional approach, something subtle that would bypass polite deception and force the hidden truth to reveal itself. He began by speaking to the assembled group in a gentle, conversational tone, not as a man demanding answers, but as a man curious about human nature. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his eyes scanning the room, "I am always fascinated by memory, by the ways small details impress themselves upon our minds. Let me propose a simple exercise." He gestured toward the study door, still sealed by police tape. "I will ask each of you to describe, in precise detail, the final moments before the scream was heard. Every detail matters, no matter how trivial." At first, the diplomats exchanged nervous glances, unsure how their recollections could yield more than confusion. Poirot's calm insistence, however, encouraged them. He spoke slowly, coaxing images from their minds, and asked them to recall sounds, gestures, even smells details that might seem inconsequential to ordinary observation. One by one they spoke. The envoy described moving from one corner of the salon to another, glancing toward the study several times but claiming to see nothing unusual. The secretary recounted her supervision of the guests, her careful monitoring of entrances and exits. The spouse offered a composed narrative of attending to her own movements, noting the general flow of conversation. Poirot listened attentively, interjecting with soft prompts. Was there a sound unusual? A hesitation in conversation? Something unexpected? As the group spoke, the detective's attention drifted to the envoy. His responses were precise, measured, almost rehearsed. Yet there was a subtle hesitation, a brief flicker in his eyes, whenever Poirot mentioned the study's locked door or the precise timing of the scream. The envoy's posture stiffened, fingers clenching briefly at the edge of the chair. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Ah, monsieur, you say you saw nothing unusual. But tell me, were you aware of the coffee tray outside the door, the untouched cup? Did it not strike you as curious?" The envoy's reaction was almost imperceptible, a flicker of surprise followed by rapid recalibration into calm composure. Yet Poirot noticed it. It was a micro-expression, a split-second lapse in control, a crack in the carefully maintained facade. "Curious, yes," the envoy said slowly, choosing his words. "I suppose one might find it so." Poirot's eyes glimmered. One might indeed. Yet such curiosity is not the same for everyone, n'est-ce pas? Some notice, some do not. Some hesitate, some act. The detective shifted, speaking now to the room at large, though his gaze never left the envoy. Memory is a delicate instrument. It preserves truth. When the mind is pressured, when emotion intrudes upon routine, when details conflict with expectation. Let us observe. Suppose that tonight we revisit the study. Calmly, as if examining the scene for the first time. You will each walk the corridor in the order of your memories, as precisely as possible. We shall see what impressions endure and which fade, for the mind reveals more than speech ever can. Some of the diplomats murmured uncertainty, but Poirot's quiet authority, combined with the subtle suggestion that the exercise was innocuous, overcame their hesitation. One by one, they retraced the steps described, speaking aloud their impressions. Poirot watched closely, noting posture, glance, voice inflection, hesitation. The envoy faltered, not in movement, but in description. When asked to note the exact moment he supposedly observed nothing unusual, his timing was off by nearly a minute. The discrepancy was slight, almost negligible, but to Poirot it was significant, and when pressed gently about the coffee tray, he lingered, searching for a plausible narrative, then backtracked with a subtle overcorrection, a defensive precision that betrayed internal dissonance. Poirot made a quiet mental note. The crack was tiny but visible to the careful observer. A lapse in timing, a flicker of hesitation, a slight overcompensation. These were hallmarks of guilt disguised as composure. The psychological test had worked. No physical evidence was needed to produce a response. The envoy, consciously or not, had revealed the first genuine imperfection in an otherwise flawless performance. Stepping back, Poirot allowed the moment to settle. He did not accuse, he did not confront. He merely observed, silently cataloguing the behavior, the subtleties, the inconsistencies. The room resumed its uneasy calm, unaware of the significance of the small reveal. Poirot's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. A single crack in the facade was enough to illuminate the path ahead. The unconventional clue, a psychological nudge, a careful test of memory and composure had exposed the first tangible sign that the murderer's mask was not entirely unbroken. And Poirot knew, with the certainty of one who has seen a pattern before it is fully revealed, that the next step would draw out even more cracks, until the shadow hiding in plain sight could no longer resist the light. The afternoon sun had shifted across the tall windows, painting long golden beams across the polished floor of the salon, yet the atmosphere was far from warm. Poirot stood near the study door, reviewing the impressions he had gathered, replaying the envoy's subtle hesitations and miscalculations. Each detail was a stitch in the fabric of the case, and the pattern was beginning to emerge until, abruptly, the fragile web of evidence was pulled apart. A shout echoed from the far end of the corridor. The chief, red-faced and alarmed, gestured violently toward the desk. "Monsieur Poirot, the vial, it is gone. The evidence has vanished." A murmur ran through the room, a mixture of shock and disbelief. The polished brass of the vial had been removed from the drawer, replaced only by the empty indentation where it had rested. Police tape did little to conceal the anxiety now rippling through the diplomats. How could this happen? The study had been under constant watch, the room sealed, the door observed, and yet someone had managed to remove the crucial piece of the puzzle without detection. Poirot's eyes narrowed, not in panic but in calculation. "Ah," he murmured softly. "We are in the presence of deliberate interference. Someone seeks to impede the progress of the investigation, to obscure the truth with distraction. And consider we now, at the moment when momentum begins to favor clarity." The chief barked orders, summoning every available officer, demanding the study be rechecked. The corridor swept for signs of intrusion. Guests were questioned again, their testimonies repeated in a nervous chorus. All confirmed that they had seen nothing, heard nothing. And yet the vial, carefully placed, carefully observed, was gone. Poirot approached the desk slowly, fingers brushing lightly over the untouched papers, the neat alignment of documents now slightly disordered, subtle but telling. "Note," he said, "the alignment has been altered. Not violently, but enough to leave a trace for the attentive eye." The secretary appeared, eyes wide, hands pressed together. "Monsieur Poirot, how could anyone?" Her voice faltered, the facade of composure cracking for the first time. Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he observed the faint tremor in her hands, the quick, subtle glance toward the corridor, the nervous shift of weight from one foot to another, details easily overlooked by the untrained eye. But to Poirot, they were as luminous as a lantern in darkness. "Someone," Poirot said slowly, his voice calm but edged with certainty, "is working against us. They understand the importance of that vial. They understand perhaps that discovery of the truth threatens them." His gaze swept the assembled group, and they are not merely reacting, they are anticipating. The chief's irritation flared. "Do you suggest an inside job? That one of the guests removed the evidence?" Poirot inclined his head slightly. "It is a distinct possibility. Consider the psychological subtlety required. The corridor is observed, the room sealed, the authorities vigilant. Yet the vial vanishes. The act is precise, deliberate, calculated. Only someone familiar with the habits and movements of those presents of my own, with intimate knowledge, could accomplish this without detection." He paused, eyes narrowing at the envoy. The small crack revealed during the unconventional test earlier now seemed more than incidental, a precursor to bolder deception. The envoy's measured composure, previously disrupted, might now be reinforced, rehearsed in anticipation of misdirection. Yet Poirot's mind was untroubled by theatrics. The true pattern would reveal itself. Even as he spoke, Poirot sensed the shifting tides in the room. Guests exchanged wary glances, trust fraying beneath polite veneers. The theft of evidence injected tension into the very air. Suspicion blossomed, not merely between detective and suspect, but among the diplomats themselves. Alliances, long unspoken, became fragile, easily shaken by the uncertainty of who might manipulate events next. Poirot stepped closer to the door of the study. "The game," he said softly, "has become more complex. The adversary grows bold. Yet boldness contains its own signature. Every act leaves a trace, though hidden, subtle, yet observable to one who knows where to look. He placed his hand lightly on the brass handle, feeling the cool metal, steadying himself. "Now, mes amis," he murmured, "we must be more vigilant. The vanishing of the vial is not a defeat, it is an invitation. An invitation to look more closely, to observe more sharply, to uncover the truth before the shadows claim it entirely." In the golden haze of late afternoon, the study loomed ahead. Within its walls, secrets awaited. And outside, somewhere in the corridors of diplomacy, a clever hand had just revealed itself, but not entirely. Poirot, eyes glittering with quiet determination, understood that the most crucial movements of the case were about to unfold and that patience, precision, and the keenest observation would soon force the vanishing truth into the light. The evening fell quickly over Geneva, the sun disappearing behind low clouds that reflected the icy light of late winter. Poirot had returned to the salon after surveying the study for subtle traces of the vanished vial, his mind alive with threads, cross-connections, and tiny inconsistencies. The diplomats sat quietly, stiff in their chairs, murmuring nervously among themselves, each glance heavy with suspicion. Yet even as the hours stretched on, a creeping tension suggested that the night had not yet released its final surprises. Poirot was examining the placement of chairs near the grand fireplace, when a sudden sharp cry shattered the fragile calm. The room erupted in chaos. Guests surged toward the inner corridor, knocking over a small table in their panic. Poirot, small and nimble, moved swiftly through the crowd, eyes scanning for immediate threats. At the far end of the hall, the secretary's face was pale, her hands pressed to her mouth. Monsieur Poirot," she cried. "It's the envoy. He's gone." The detective's heart remained steady, but his mind raced. "Gone, you say?" he murmured. "How exactly?" He was here just a moment ago," she stammered, "and then, when I turned, he vanished. The window. The second saw it open slightly, but—" "Impossible!" No one could have. Poirot's gaze snapped toward the study corridor. The envoy's chair sat neatly in its place, undisturbed, papers aligned, as though he had been there just moments ago. Yet he was gone. Panic rippled through the guests. The chief barked orders, demanding searches, checking exits, questioning staff, but Poirot's attention remained on the details. A faint disturbance in the carpet near the window, a slight displacement of the curtain, the delicate imprint of shoe soles on the polished floor, leading toward the open balcony door. He crouched, observing the footprints with careful precision. "Ah," he murmured under his breath. "The adversary anticipates even our watchfulness. Not merely the vial, not merely the staged clues, but now an escape or abduction, executed with the same meticulous planning as the first crime." A sudden knock at the main entrance made everyone jump. Poirot's eyes flicked toward the doorway as a messenger entered, breathless, and carrying a telegram addressed to the residents. He took it with calm hands, read it quietly, and his expression did not change, but the sharp glint in his eyes betrayed his inner calculation. The message was brief, typed, and stark. "Stop meddling, or there will be another before midnight." The room went silent. A chill swept through the diplomats, the weight of unseen menace pressing down. Poirot folded the telegram slowly, his mind tracing every possible implication. The villain was not merely reactive, the villain was orchestrating, dictating the tempo of the investigation, daring the detective to catch up. The urgency had multiplied. Not only must the crime be solved, but another life, perhaps even his own, was imperiled. Poirot moved toward the balcony, stepping lightly over the faint trail of footprints. Outside, the snow glistened faintly in the lamplight, the streets quiet and empty. He noted subtle disturbances in the fresh powder, small, deliberate marks leading away from the residence toward a narrow alley. Someone had exited carefully, calculating each step to avoid detection. The envoy, whether taken or escaped, was a message in motion. The antagonist's hand was precise, cruelly clever. He returned to the room, calm, but his mind raced faster than ever. "This is no longer a puzzle of a single death," he said softly, his voice carrying over the tense silence. "This is a test, a game in which the stakes are rising, and the rules are set not by law, but by the mind of one who is several steps ahead. Whoever orchestrates these events knows timing, knowledge of the house, and the habits of those present. And now they have escalated. We must anticipate, not merely observe." The secretary clutched his sleeve, trembling. "Monsieur Poirot, Can... Will anyone stop this? Poirot bent down, eyes level with hers, calm but commanding. Yes, mademoiselle. But only if we think more carefully than ever before. The previous errors, the vanishing Vielthy, were not failures, they were warnings. The villain seeks to manipulate our attention, to guide it where it will not reveal the truth. And now, with the envoy gone and time running, we must act with equal subtlety, foresight, and precision. The next movement will be decisive. He straightened, glancing once more at the corridor and the balcony beyond. The shadows of the past, the cracks in deception, and the vanished evidence now converged with terrifying clarity. Someone, somewhere, was daring Himand the world to fail. Poirot's small, resolute frame held no fear, only a sharpened determination. He knew the game had entered its final perilous phase, and that every second until midnight counted. Poirot returned to the study once more, moving slowly, deliberately, as though the walls themselves might offer a whisper of their secrets. The corridors were quiet now. The diplomats gathered in anxious clusters in the salon, still shaken by the envoy's sudden disappearance and the vanishing vial. He allowed his eyes to roam across the familiar objects, the desk, the aligned papers, the lamp that had cast its glow on the first death, and, almost imperceptibly, the small items that everyone had long since ignored. A letter opener lying slightly askew, a tray of untouched coffee cups, the faint scuff marks on the polished floor. He paused, fingers lightly brushing the edge of the desk, and replayed the events in his mind. The quarrel between the victim and the envoy, the meticulous placement of the note, the convenient discovery of the vial, the psychological test that revealed a subtle hesitation, the sudden disappearance of the envoy had seemed disparate, chaotic even. Yet Poirot's mind, trained to perceive order where others saw only confusion, began to perceive a faint rhythm beneath the tumult. He remembered the envoy's small flicker of surprise when the coffee tray was mentioned. Then the slight misalignment of the documents after the vial had vanished. The careful, almost theatrical disappearance of the envoy himself, leaving a trail only faintly discernible in the snow outside. And finally, the telegram. Typed, precise, threatening, yet containing the same language style and timing as the note on the desk. Poirot's eyes narrowed, and a small, satisfied smile crept across his face. He walked deliberately to the stack of papers on the desk and lifted the top sheet. Beneath it, just as he had noticed days before, was the envelope containing the old letter linking the envoy and the victim. It had always been there, overlooked by others, a relic of the past, yes, but more than that, a key that illuminated the present. The pattern became clear. Each seemingly random or coincidental detail was a deliberate marker, a signature left by a mind obsessed with precision and theatricality. The first murder, the cryptic message, the carefully staged vial, the psychological hints, the envoy's disappearance were not isolated events. They formed a deliberate sequence, each step designed to manipulate attention, to mislead, and to compel the observer to follow a path chosen by the criminal. Poirot reflected on the minor deviations he had noticed. A chair slightly displaced, a faint fingerprint smudged on the window latch, the timing inconsistencies of the envoy's recollections. They were all part of a rhythm, a subtle orchestration to test the vigilance of those who sought the truth. And now, with the envoy missing, the stakes had escalated. The criminal had moved from manipulation to direct action, confident that chaos would conceal motive. He allowed his gaze to shift toward the balcony, recalling the faint trail in the snow that had suggested an escape. There, too, the pattern was evident. The footprints were deliberate, positioned to appear as if the envoy had fled, yet they subtly looped back toward the residence, implying the possibility of a hidden path within the walls, a method of egress only known to someone intimately familiar with the building. Poirot returned to the floor, crouching beside the faint marks, and traced them mentally alongside the known movements of the secretary and the servants. He considered the subtle lapses in speech, the hesitation during the psychological test, the overcompensation in gestures. Each anomaly was not a mistake but a signal, a clue the criminal had left unintentionally, revealing the hand behind the entire series of events. He straightened, and his eyes swept across the salon, observing the gathered guests, noting the small adjustments in posture, the shifting glances, the uneasy attempts at normal conversation. The pattern extended beyond objects that existed within the behaviors, the reactions, the intricate dance of human psychology that the criminal had attempted to control. "Ah, oui," Poirot murmured to himself, voice barely audible. "Everything has been in plain sight, hidden only by assumption and distraction. The true author of this chaos has left subtle signs, assuming that they would be overlooked. But the rhythm cannot escape the attentive eye. The key has always been here." With that realization, a sense of clarity settled over him. The case was no longer a series of disjointed crises. It was a coherent, albeit devious, sequence of events, a pattern meticulously laid out by a mind both patient and precise. The missing vial, the envoy's disappearance, the cryptic messages, and the faint traces of past grievances were all integral to the same design. Poirot's small, keen eyes gleamed with anticipation. The pattern was visible, the method discernible, and the criminal's intent, though still hidden in the shadows, was now traceable. The detective knew that the next steps would not merely solve the case, would anticipate the moves of a mind several steps ahead, closing in on the one who had orchestrated a riddle in the very heart of Geneva. Poirot lingered by the study door, fingers lightly brushing the polished wood, his mind tracing the sequence of events with the precision of a mathematician. The pattern was clear now, but clarity is only the prelude to understanding, and understanding requires insight into the human heart as well as the human hand. He had traced the movements, reconstructed the timeline, and observed the subtle cracks in the facades, but why? That question lingered, invisible yet insistent. He summoned the assembled diplomats, staff, and household members once more. The room fell silent as he entered, small, unassuming, yet commanding with a presence that could make even the most imposed person falter. Poirot's gaze swept across them, noting every micro-expression, every twitch of finger or lip, every breath held a second too long. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began softly, "we have observed errors, lapses, and peculiarities. We have noted vanished evidence and evasions. And yet, there remains one question. Why would someone go to such lengths not merely to kill, not merely to manipulate, but to construct an elaborate multi-stage riddle so precise, so theatrical, that the attention of even trained investigators is ensnared?" He paused, letting the silence hang like a thread in the room, and then moved slowly toward the center of the salon. "The answer," he said, "is not found in greed, nor ambition, nor petty revenge. These are too simple, too crude, too ordinary. No. The answer lies in the mind itself, the desire to control perception, to orchestrate not only action but understanding, to play with the very way in which others see truth." Eyes widened, a few shifting nervously. Poirot's tone softened, yet every word landed with the weight of inevitability. "The villain is a master of the human psyche, obsessed with certainty, with proving their intellect over others. The murder, the cryptic note, the vanishing vial, the disappearancial were designed not merely to remove a person or conceal a truth, but to test the limits of observation and judgment, to prove, if only to themselves, that they could manipulate mind, time, and circumstance perfectly." He turned to the envoy, who had returned quietly under careful supervision. The man's composure was strained, his usual calm now pierced by subtle tension. "You see, Monsieur," Poirot continued, "this was never about what is easily recognized, money, status, influence. It was about control, the ultimate assertion of intellect and foresight. To construct a tableau in which every participant is observed, every reaction noted, every expectation subtly misdirected. A masterpiece of psychological precision." The envoy's jaw tightened. His hands fidgeted briefly, betraying the first true sign of inner conflict. Poirot's small, sharp eyes flicked to that imperceptible tremor. "Ah," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. There it lies, the admission through behavior, even without confession, desire for control, and fear of losing it. Poirot stepped closer, voice lowering. The initial disagreement, the quarrel, was a mere echo of an older grievancey, a minor spark, compared to the fire of obsession that guided every subsequent act. The past provided opportunity, the present provided instruments, but the core lies in a mind that delights in orchestrating perfection, that measures others' perception as a sculptor measures clay. To such a mind, a life taken, a secret revealed, or a scream heard at exactly 12:16 is but part of the art. He swept his gaze across the room, absorbing the subtle tension in every face. This is why the case has confounded ordinary logic. Motive is ordinarily simple, but when the mind itself becomes the object, the act becomes a riddle. Each minor inconsistency, hesitation, the missing vial, the small misalignments were all clues not merely to the act, but to the psyche behind it. Poirot paused, letting the weight of his words settle. It is a rare mind that kills to demonstrate intellect rather than passion, that manipulates time and sequence as one would manipulate pieces on a chessboard. It is a mind that measures every detail, anticipates every observer, and derives satisfaction from the orchestration itself. That, mesdames et messieurs, is the true motive. Control, intellectual triumph, and the assurance that even in death, the victim's presence serves the design of the criminal mind. A tremor passed through the envoy, subtle yet unmistakable. Poirot's eyes lingered, sharp, precise, as if reading the invisible ledger of thought written upon muscle and expression. "And now," he said softly, "the riddle has been understood, the motive revealed, and the method visible. The final act, however, must still unfold, for knowledge alone is not enough without action to compel revelation." The room held its collective breath, the weight of insight pressing on every shoulder. Poirot, small and unassuming, yet radiant with the certainty of intellect, had stripped away the superficial motives and exposed the core. A mind driven not by ordinary desire, but by the intricate, terrifying need to dominate the very perception of truth. The game was nearly complete, and only the final maneuver remained before the riddle of Geneva would be fully unveiled. Poirot spent the remainder of the evening in quiet preparation, assembling the threads of the investigation into a coherent whole. Every detail, every hesitation, every subtle discrepancy was catalogued in his mind, ready to be deployed. He did not rush, for he knew that timing was as critical as insight. A premature confrontation could allow the criminal to vanish once more. The villa was still hushed, the diplomats nervously whispering among themselves, while the shadows lengthened across the polished floors, stretching like fingers toward the corners where secrets lingered. When the hour was right, Poirot called the key individuals back into the salon. He did not accuse, he did not brandish evidence, but allowed his presence to fill the room with quiet authority. The envoy, seated slightly apart, appeared combat. Poirot, with his small, precise gestures, detected the almost imperceptible tension in his hands, the tautness of his jaw, the shallow rhythm of his breathing. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice soft yet unyielding, "we have traced each step, observed each reaction, reconstructed each movement, and examined each psychological nuance. The riddle that has plagued this residence is now complete. What remains is to consider not what is seen, but what is concealed." He paused, letting his words settle like dust in the still air, and then moved closer to the envoy. "Monsieur," he said, his small frame barely noticeable in the grandeur of the room, "you are a man of intellect, precision, and remarkable foresight. You have orchestrated events with care, believing that none could discern the design. And yet, you underestimated the power of observation coupled with patience." The envoy's composure flickered for a moment, a shadow crossing his face. Poirot's sharp eyes noted it. "I have considered the quarrel, the old grievance, the disappearance, the staged evidence, the messages, the subtle manipulations of behavior. All of it has one origin, one mind behind it, and one ultimate purpose: the demonstration of control, the orchestration of intellect. And that mind, monsieur, is yours." The room stilled. The diplomats and staff exchanged nervous glances, some staring in disbelief, others in barely contained fear. The envoy's lips tightened, his gaze darting toward the door, toward the shadows beyond the windows. Poirot continued without hesitation. "You believed the vial, the vanishing, the psychological misdirections would shield you. You believed the pattern was invisible, but the pattern was always there. Every hesitation, every subtle gesture, every minute misalignment each was a mark you left unintentionally, betraying the perfection you so dearly desired." The envoy's hand twitched, a sudden movement that betrayed an impulse. Poirot, calm and deliberate, took a step closer. "Do not attempt to flee, monsieur. You are contained by observation, by circumstance. by your own need for perfection. Any rash movement would disrupt the sequence you have so carefully designed. For a tense heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then the envoy spoke, voice low, controlled, but trembling with the faintest trace of desperation. "And if it is true, if you have indeed seen through my design, what then? Can justice be executed upon such intellect?" Poirot's small eyes glimmered, and he smiled faintly, almost kindly. "Justice is not a question of intellect alone, monsieur. It is a question of truth. You have acted to manipulate perception, to dominate understanding. Yet in the end, the truth asserts itself, and so the sequence is complete. You are caught, not by chance, but by the very patterns you assumed only you could control." The envoy's shoulders slumped slightly, the first concession of inevitability. His gaze darted again toward the open balcony, toward the faint snowy streets beyond, as if weighing the possibilities of escape. But Poirot's presence was unyielding, and the subtle surveillance he had orchestrated to police, staff, the careful observation of micro-expression censured, there was no outlet. With a small, precise gesture, Poirot produced the recovered vial, which had been secretly retrieved from its temporary hiding place, and laid it on the desk. "The instrument of distraction and deception is here. The psychological tests, the vanished evidence, the pattern of behavioral are laid bare. And now you are confronted with the undeniable conclusion of your own design." The envoy's hands shook ever so slightly, and he drew a deep, almost imperceptible breath. "Yes," he whispered, almost to himself, "the pattern, it cannot be denied. The sequence is mine. But it was flawless in your mind, perhaps," Poirot replied gently, "but not in reality. Observation, patience, and a careful mind have unraveled what you thought impervious. Your desire for control has, ironically, led you to your own capture." The envoy sank into the nearest chair, head bowed, the tension in the room gradually easing as the assembled guests began to comprehend the resolution. Poirot, small, composed, and entirely serene, surveyed the scene. Every detail had been accounted for, every psychological nuance anticipated. The riddle of Geneva, intricate and tortuous, had reached its conclusion, and the mind behind the chaos had finally been brought into the light. In the quiet that followed, Poirot allowed himself a faint smile. The case had demanded patience, observation, and a mastery of both human behavior and minute detail, but now, at last, the truth was fully revealed, and the shadows of deception receded into memory. The room had begun to settle, the tension easing as the envoy, now subdued and aware of his exposure, slumped into the chair. The diplomats and staff exhaled, relief mingling with lingering shock. Poirot, small and poised, allowed the air to hang heavy for a moment, as though savoring the completion of the intricate psychological tableau he had so carefully unraveled. Yet even as calm seemed to descend, his mind remained alert, restless with that subtle sense of something overlooked, a whisper of inconsistency, a trace of shadow in a room bathed in light. He walked slowly along the corridor, revisiting the traces left by the envoy's movements, the faint scuffs near the balcony, the slightly disturbed curtain, the alignment of papers on the desk. His eyes, small but piercing, noted the minutest variations, the almost imperceptible signs that contradicted the narrative everyone had accepted. He paused beside the secretary, whose hands were folded tightly in her lap, and allowed a gentle observation to cross his mind. Her movements, previously read as mere nervousness, had always contained an element of preemptive calculation, as though she had known the patterns before they unfolded. Poirot's lips curved into the tiniest smile. "Ah, mon Dieu," he murmured softly, almost to himself. "The game is never truly over until the final move is made." He returned to the salon, deliberately slow, as if allowing the moment to crystallize in the minds of the guests. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, voice soft, but carrying the weight of authority, "we have unraveled the motives, the methods, and the manipulations of our gentleman here." He nodded toward the envoy, and indeed his intellect has been formidable. Yet even the most meticulous design leaves a trace, does it not? The envoy looked up, eyes narrowing, but said nothing. Poirot continued, stepping closer to the desk, fingers brushing lightly over the papers. "I have studied the sequence of events, the behaviors, the tiny cracks in composure, the movements of all present. And it has led me with perfect clarity to the conclusion that the master of the pattern, the architect of the chaos, was not entirely who we believed. A hush fell. The assembled guests exchanged uneasy glances. The envoy's expression flickered with confusion, and even the chief stiffened, sensing the subtle shift in tone. Poirot's gaze swept the room, finally settling on the secretary. She shifted slightly. A minute, involuntary movement, her eyes betraying the first flash of recognition and fear. "Ah, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "you have served faithfully, observed attentively, and maintained your composure admirably. Yet your actions, subtle as they were, reveal the final truth. While Monsieur here executed the immediate steps, it was you who orchestrated the framework, the connections, the manipulations, the cues. You guided the events, masked the motives, and ensured the illusion of control. Without your quiet hand, the riddle could never have been so compelling." The secretary's face paled. A breathless tremor ran through her hands, the first genuine crack in her poised exterior. She opened her mouth, then closed it, words failing her. The envoy looked at her, confusion and dawning comprehension mingling in his gaze. Poirot's voice was calm, measured, unyielding. "It is a rare mind, indeed, that can manipulate another so completely, that can construct a labyrinth of actions, motives, and distractions, while remaining unnoticed. Yet all actions leave a trace, and all patterns can be discerned if one knows where to look." He stepped closer to the secretary, his small eyes catching the faintest quiver of breath. "You wish to prove, perhaps, that intellect alone could dominate not just events, but perception itself. You engineered the sequence, using the envoy's past grievance as a catalyst, while allowing him to assume the role of the mastermind. You created misdirection, control, and drama. Yet, as always, human behavior subtle, involuntary, unavoidable betrays the truth." A long silence followed, the room holding its collective breath. Finally, the secretary's shoulders slumped, and she let out a slow, measured sigh, as though surrendering to inevitability. "Yes," she whispered, voice trembling but clear. I did not intend to kill, but everything was my design. The pattern, the manipulations. I had to prove it, had to see if control could be complete." Poirot nodded slightly, small hands folded neatly before him. And so, the riddle was complete, yet the true architect was hidden in plain sight. The game was not merely to commit a crime, nor to manipulate perception for a moment, but to test the very limits of observation, patience, and deduction. The envoy remained frozen, a mixture of awe, disbelief, and relief washing over him. The diplomats whispered among themselves, astonished at the revelation, while the chief simply shook his head, unable to conceal his amazement. Poirot, serene as ever, stepped back, eyes sweeping the room. "The final twist," he said softly, "is that the mind capable of orchestrating these events need not be the most visible, the loudest, or the seemingly dominant. Sometimes the true mastermind resides quietly, observing, calculating, and waiting until the last move is made." The room, filled with shock and comprehension, held its breath. In that moment, the full scope of the Geneva Riddle was revealed, a tapestry of intellect, manipulation, and subtle control, culminating not with the obvious villain, but with the quiet hand that had guided every move from the shadows. Poirot's small smile deepened slightly. The puzzle was solved, but only because he had seen the invisible threads that connected them all. The salon remained tense long after the secretary's reluctant confession. Guests and staff alike were frozen, caught between astonishment and the unsettling realization that the mind orchestrating the chaos had been far closer than anyone had imagined. The envoy sat quietly, relief mingling uneasily with a lingering sense of betrayal, while the chief of police scribbled furiously in a notebook, struggling to reconcile what had just been revealed. Poirot moved deliberately, small steps echoing softly against the polished floor. He allowed the weight of silence to settle before speaking, his voice calm and measured, carrying the authority of someone who understood every nuance of human behavior. "Mesdames et messieurs, we now see the sequence in its entirety. The initial quarrel, the vanished vial, the psychological tests, the sudden disappearance, and the seeming manipulations of the envoy, each was a stage in a carefully constructed performance. And yet, the most subtle cues, those overlooked by ordinary observation, revealed the true architect. He paused, eyes sweeping the room, and lifted his fingers slightly toward the secretary. Observe the small signs. Her posture, always just a fraction too poised, the hands that rarely trembled except when pressed, the glances that calculated more than they concealed. Even when others assumed she acted as a passive instrument, her mind was active, directing, anticipating. The traces were there all along, hidden in plain sight, yet invisible to those who expected the mastermind to be obvious. The secretary lowered her gaze, acknowledging silently the small truths Poirot had laid bare. Even the envoy, humbled and subdued, now seemed to grasp the depth of her orchestration, the layered subtlety that had allowed him to assume the role of the villain while remaining, in effect, the instrument of her design. Poirot's small hands folded neatly before him, and he allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. "And yet," he continued, "justice, as we understand it, does not always arrive in the way we imagine. The authorities will act upon the confession and the evidence, yes, yet the mind that orchestrated this riddle leaves us with more than a single truth. It leaves a lesson that the smallest detail, a hesitant breath, a faint misalignment, a micro-expression can be the key to unraveling even the most cunning plan." He moved toward the desk, pointing gently to the scattered papers and the recovered vial. The vial itself, though central to the initial panic, was a distraction, a false focus. The vanishing of the envoy seemed a desperate act, but in truth, it was part of the larger design to mislead the observer, to test their insight. And the psychological exercise, what some considered subtle probing or chance observations, were, in reality, mirrors held up to the suspects, exposing reactions that betrayed more than words ever could. A low murmur ran through the room, acknowledgement of Poirot's brilliance. Yet the calm that had begun to settle was not complete. The secretary, though now fully exposed, moved with a quiet deliberation, and Poirot noted it with the slightest arch of his brow. Even in confession, some facets of her mind remained elusive, a lingering shadow of control that unsettled the room. Poirot's gaze lingered on her, then swept across the room once more. "Thus, mesdames et messieurs," he said, voice softening yet resonant, "while the immediate danger is contained and the truth revealed, there remains the echo of possibility. The mind capable of such orchestration is not extinguished by mere capture or confession. Its lessons linger, and those who observe carefully may yet discern traces of its ingenuity elsewhere." The chief of police, noting the accuracy of Poirot's deductions, nodded grimly, realizing that the case would be cited in reports for years as a rare instance of psychological mastery and criminal cunning. The envoy, though spared the full consequences, now carried with him the weight of his misjudgment and unwitting role in the performance. Poirot straightened, small but immovable, a figure of calm intellect amid the unsettled crowd. "The Geneva Riddle is resolved," he said quietly, "and yet, as in all matters of human complexity, complete resolution is an illusion. The villain is known, yet the depth of intellect, the patience, the subtleties of observation these remain, like shadows, lingering even in the light of revelation. Justice in form is served, but the mind that created this chaos, it may yet escape in part into memory and example, leaving us ever vigilant." The room exhaled collectively, some in relief, some in awe, and Poirot, serene as always, allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The hidden clues, once invisible, had been uncovered, the pattern discerned, and the mastermind exposed, and yet the subtle sense of unfinished business lingered, a reminder that the human mind, with its capacity for cunning and calculation, could never be entirely contained. The riddle was complete, but its echoes would endure, a testament to the brilliance of both crime and detection. The first light of dawn crept over Geneva, washing the city in pale gold, yet inside the villa the shadows of the night's events lingered, stubborn and unyielding. Poirot moved quietly through the now empty corridors, each step measured, deliberate, as though the polished floors themselves bore witness to the intricate sequence of human actions that had unfolded. The diplomats had departed, murmuring thanks and polite astonishment, and the chief of police remained behind only to file notes, a testament to the extraordinary complexity of the case he had just witnessed. Poirot paused in the study, gazing once more at the desk, the papers, the recovered vial. Everything seemed orderly now, Yet he could not dismiss the faint, nagging sense that one small thread had yet to be fully accounted for. The secretary had confessed, the envoy's part revealed, the pattern unraveled, but the mind behind the orchestration had left subtle traces, ephemeral yet deliberate, that suggested not finality, but continuity. He traced his fingers along the edge of the desk, pausing at a faint smudge in the ink on one of the letters. It was almost imperceptible, easily overlooked, yet for Poirot, it sparked the memory of a subtle irregularity in the secretary's encounter, fleeting contradiction, a hesitation too brief for any ordinary observer to note, yet enough for the attentive mind to register. Had it been intentional, a final flourish, or merely an oversight? He did not yet know. Stepping into the salon, he allowed his eyes to sweep the room one last time. The soft light of morning illuminated the details he had so carefully observed throughout the investigation. The alignment of the furniture, the subtle impressions left on the carpet, the faint traces of footprints near the balcony, all had contributed to revealing the pattern, yet some faint elements, an offhand remark, a delayed glance, a minor gesture remained as questions unanswered. Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The case was resolved, yet the human mind, like a labyrinth, often held corridors unseen, even by those who had mapped the main passages. He moved toward the window, looking out over the snow-dusted streets of Geneva. The city was waking, unaware of the night's intellectual theatre, unaware of the meticulous orchestration of motive and manipulation that had played out in the villa. And yet, in the quiet of the early morning, Poirot's mind wandered forward, as always alert to the whispers of future intrigue. Perhaps another message would arrive, subtle and cryptic. Perhaps a small inconsistency in a seemingly ordinary case would reveal itself as part of a far more elaborate puzzle. As he turned from the window, Poirot's gaze fell once more upon the secretary's chair, now empty. There had been no outward sign that she had left anything unresolved, yet the detective's keen eyes noted the faintest impression on the armrest, a tiny scratch, shallow, barely perceptible, almost casual. It was as if someone had left a message in miniature, a clue to a thought unspoken. Poirot's small smile deepened even in confession. Some secrets remain, and some games extend beyond a single night. He straightened and adjusted his coat, the familiar sensation of purpose settling comfortably on his shoulders. The villa, once a theatre of deception and carefully constructed misdirection, was now still and orderly. But Poirot knew that the world beyond its walls held countless other patterns waiting to be discovered. The thrill of unraveling human complexity, of perceiving subtle truths invisible to ordinary eyes, was never-ending. Stepping into the crisp morning air, he allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. The riddle of Geneva had been solved, the mastermind exposed, the motives revealed, but the echoes of subtle deception lingered, like shadows in the corners of perception. Even when justice is delivered, even when the truth is laid bare, the mind capable of design, subtlety, and concealment leaves traces that demand vigilance, curiosity, and intellect. And so Poirot walked down the snow-lined streets, small and composed, yet entirely alive to the possibilities of unseen patterns and hidden truths. He knew that the city, the world, and the human heart were filled with mysteries waiting to be unraveled. The case was complete. And yet, as always, the riddle continued, an invitation to perception, observation, and the relentless pursuit of truth. For as long as there were minds to deceive and eyes to observe, the detective's work would never truly end. A faint wind stirred the lamplight along the quiet avenue, and Poirot's keen eyes caught a small scrap of paper fluttering in the snow, a barely perceptible mark against the white. He stooped, picking it up with delicate precision, and read the cryptic message inscribed. "Not all is as it seems. Watch carefully." Poirot's lips curved into the tiniest, knowing smile. The riddle was solved, yet a new puzzle had already begun, and with that he walked on, small and deliberate, a quiet sentinel of intellect, amid the endless complexity of the human world, ready for whatever mysteries awaited.